National Defense in the 21st Century. And to speak to us, we have Dr. Lawrence Korb. Dr. Korb received his PhD from the State University of New York and has 14 years of teaching experience at the University of Dayton, the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, the U.S. Naval War College, and Georgetown University. His public services includes Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower, Reserve Affairs, Installations, and Logistics from 1981 to 1985. He has been Vice President, Corporate Operations at the Raytheon Company, Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy, Education, and Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies programs at the Brookings Institution. And now, he is the Vice President of the Council on Foreign Relations. Among numerous important association memberships is that of Chairman of the Board for the Committee of National Security. Dr. Korb has authorized 15 books and more than 150 articles which have appeared in the nation's leading national security and foreign policy journals. His participation in the public discussion includes over 500 appearances as a commentator on distinguished news shows and op-ed pieces in the nation's major newspapers. With this background, few are qualified to address the design of national defense policy as Dr. Korb. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Lawrence Korb to the Council.
Thank you very, very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for turning out on a lovely evening. The planning for this was wonderful, except for one small detail. There was a ball game tonight, and I was getting here, and I thought everything was on time. I pulled off the highway, and then all of a sudden, we didn't move anymore. And I was thinking, gee, that many people coming out to hear me speak, and then what I want to do is tonight talk about our national defense policy and really start with what's happening today, because I think what's going on right now in Kosovo is sort of a way in which we can frame the debate about national defense policy. And really what you see playing out in Kosovo, as we have seen in many of the other of the post-Cold War foreign policy or military operations, is a battle between two doctrines, which for purposes of analysis I'll call the Clinton Doctrine and the Powell Doctrine. And whether you subscribe to one or other of those has profound consequences for the type of military you want to have, the policy that you want to follow when you want to employ that military, where you invest your money, and what role you see the United States playing in the world. Let me begin with the Clinton Doctrine. The Clinton Doctrine rests on two premises and also two historical analogies. The Clinton Doctrine argues that if you have a situation in which there's a moral reason because of a humanitarian crisis, and the United States can do something about it, it should take action and do something, particularly if it has some sort of strategic implications, either direct or indirect. If you listen to the President's speeches when we went to Bosnia and when we started the operation in Kosovo, you'll notice that he talked about these two themes. He's usually begun with the humanitarian situation, in which he has spelled out the number of refugees, people displaced from their homes, people killed, and talk about how horrible that is, and the fact that we, the United States, not only because of our military and economic power, but also because of our moral authority, cannot turn a blind eye to. And then he usually goes on and talks about the strategic connotations. And both in Bosnia and Kosovo, he has argued that we had a strategic reason for getting involved militarily because it could destabilize Europe. And the words, interestingly enough, for the speeches in Bosnia and Kosovo are almost the same, that if it spills over, it could destabilize the area, bring in Greece and Turkey, NATO allies, and how if you have a sick southeastern Europe, you can't have a whole healthy Europe, and how important that is to us. And he's also referenced the experiences of World War I and World War II by saying, I'm sending a small amount of Americans, or I'm using a small amount of power early, so I won't have to send hundreds or thousands or even millions as we did in 1916, 17, and during the 1940s. Now, if you examine this closely, you'll see this relies on two historical analogies. One is Auschwitz, the other is Sarajevo, 1914. And as you know, the world said after the horrors of the concentration camps were discovered at the end of World War II that never again would we allow this type of behavior to go unopposed and unpunished. And while ethnic cleansing is not exactly a Holocaust, it certainly does look very much like it. And I think it's interesting that in the early days of the Clinton administration, when the president would talk about us getting involved, usually Elie Wiesel would come to the White House and speak out on his behalf. And the Sarajevo 1914 analogy, obviously, that's how World War I started, with trouble in the Balkans, and pretty soon a war that nobody seemed to want grew into a larger war, and literally millions of people were killed before it ends 5 years later. And so that's the Clinton Doctrine. And as I will show, that if you support that, it has tremendous ramifications for the type of forces you buy, what you spend on defense, and how you employ these men and women. Now, there's another point of view, and that's the Powell Doctrine. And you may, if you saw last Sunday's New York Times, remember there was an article in there by Eric Schmidt talking about the Powell Doctrine and the way in which he approached it. Now, the Powell Doctrine comes from a different point of view. It says that before you employ military force, you should ask yourself the following questions. What is my objective? What am I trying to accomplish with those military forces? Am I prepared to use all of the force that's necessary to achieve that objective quickly and decisively? And when I achieve that objective, have I figured out how I'm going to get out of the place? And unless you can answer all those questions, you ought not to send America or commit American power. Now, General Powell doesn't argue that you should ignore the situation, and I think that's important to keep in mind. He doesn't say, well, forget about it. He says there are other things that you can do, or maybe other nations ought to get involved. But before the United States commits its force, you need to ask those questions. Now, General Powell and his military colleagues and a lot of people in the American population embrace that doctrine because they don't look at Auschwitz and Sarajevo 1914. They look at two other historical happenings. One is Vietnam and the other is Lebanon. What they would argue is when we went to Vietnam, we had no clear objective. It was kind of fuzzy. And it seemed to change an awful lot. Certainly, we weren't prepared to use all of the power necessary to achieve that objective quickly and decisively, and then we could never figure out how to get out. I mean, so fuzzy were our objectives that during that war, there was a senator from Vermont by the name of George Aiken, who rose in the Senate in the late 60s when Vietnam was literally tearing this country apart, and said, I have the solution. I said, well, what's that, Senator? He said, we'll declare victory and go home. And of course, if you don't have clear, specific objectives, then you can declare victory and say, well, I accomplished it. And then, of course, Lebanon, what happened in Lebanon was 1982. the United States went in along with the French and the Italians. We couldn't go in through the UN because we had a Soviet veto. NATO was still preoccupied with a pending Soviet attack on Europe, so they couldn't divert the forces. But the United States went in with France and Italy in 1982 so that the PLO and the Israelis could withdraw simultaneously because for obvious reasons neither trusted the other to go first and they wanted to ensure that both sides got out simultaneously so nobody would take advantage of it. So we went in and we did that. Both sides withdrew. What happened is then we left. People forget that. We left. And then you began to have massacres inside Lebanon, and people said, you've got to go back in to stop this horrible thing. So we did. We went back in, and then our objectives changed. Our objective, well, what was it? To restore Lebanon as an independent state? Were we going to guarantee the security of Lebanon? We weren't quite clear. And you may remember we sort of hunkered down at the Beirut airport just to be there and went out on patrols to bring about a certain amount of instability. Well, what happened is we got involved in this thing we now call nation building. We became de facto allies of the Gemayel government. There were people there who were not happy with that arrangement. And then, of course, 240 Marines, as well as several hundred French and Italians were killed in October of 1983, and we left. And so the military is saying, you know, you can't go in, you don't choose sides in a civil war, because if you do, you turn everybody against you. Now stop and think of what's happened in Bosnia and Kosovo as you think through those two doctrines. When we went to Bosnia, certainly the president argued, and he embraced his own doctrine, and that's why we give it that name. Some people say it's really the influence of Secretary Albright, and they call it the Do Ability Doctrine. If you can do something, you ought to do it. But when we went in, it wasn't quite clear what our objective was in Bosnia. Certainly, you had these horrible things happening. One could make a case there were strategic interests involved. But what were we there to do? Were we there to build a multi-ethnic state? Were we there to enforce a partition? And how long would we stay? Well, because those questions weren't clear, you may remember what we did when we went in. We said, we're going to stay for a year. And people quite naturally said, well, what happens if you haven't done what you came to do in a year? And I can show you testimony, and history is filled with ironies. In fact, if you stay in this business long enough, what goes around comes around. There was then Senator Bill Cohen shaking his finger at the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and saying, well, what happens if after a year you don't have a state that's working well? And the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said before Congress, and the President said before the American people, well, we'll give him a year, and that's all we can do. If after that we can say we've done our best, and we'll leave. Well, of course, we didn't leave in a year, but because there were no casualties, you were able to continue keeping the people there. Now, when we got in there, if you really wanted to rebuild the state, one of the things that you had to do was go after the war criminals aggressively. But we didn't do that because we knew if we got involved in that, that would be nation building. And really what you saw there was sort of a Clinton Doctrine and Powell Doctrine almost side by side. Our objective or exit strategy basically became to get out of there without any casualties. And we didn't want to get involved in a civil war. And that tension still remains today. Yes, we have stopped the killing. There's no doubt about that. But is Bosnia any closer to being a multi-ethnic state than it was before? No. All of the refugees have not gone back. Some have gone back. Is our objective partition? Well, we still haven't really been clear about that because you have these two doctrines. Now let's fast forward to Kosovo. Right. When you had a similar situation in Kosovo, if you said, all right, here is a humanitarian crisis, and here is, with strategic overtones, we've got to go in and do something. Well, when you have a military operation, what you normally do is you plan for the worst and hope for the best. But in this situation, what did we do? We said, well, we're going to use air power. Well, you may remember a couple of days before the war in Kosovo started, the Italian Prime Minister was was visiting the United States, and lost in what was going on because at that time he was very concerned about what happened and that trial down in Camp Lejeune for the Marines who had flown through and cut the gondola. But there was a little item that appeared in the paper. The Italian Prime Minister said, well, Mr. President, if we bomb Kosovo or we bomb Serbia and Mr. Milosevic doesn't sign Rambouillet, what do we do? The President didn't say anything, and he turned to his national security advisor, Sandy Berger, and Berger said, well, we'll bomb some more. Well, if in fact you argued that this had humanitarian and strategic implications, you would have said, okay, here's the situation, we'll use all of our military power to take care of that situation, and we'll fix it. But we didn't. We said we're going to bomb, okay, use air power and cruise missiles. Why? Because that doesn't put any men and women at great risk. And what was our objective? Well, we started talking about degrading his capability to inflict horrors on the people of Kosovo. Now, what does degrade mean? Have we degraded? Yes, we have. Okay, because obviously every time you drop a bomb or you do something to the infrastructure, the military infrastructure, you've degraded it. But why no ground forces? Well, of course, then you run into the Powell Doctrine, okay? Are you prepared to use them all and use military power quickly and decisively, and are you ready to get out? And that's really where we are right now in this country. Now, ideally what should happen is this is something that should be debated in a presidential election, because this is key not only to how we do things, but where we spend our money. And we should have debate. Now, as I can see it, the Democrats are more sympathetic, obviously, to the Powell Doctrine. And I mean, you see it in the Democratic Party. And I assume if Vice President Gore gets the nomination, he will be sympathetic to it. And the Republicans are more sympathetic to the Powell Doctrine, if you look at the way that the Congress has asked these questions. And so what we should do is, in a presidential election, we should lay it out. Because one thing we know about the international system right now, it's in a period where you have many failed states and you have these unspeakable horrors happening as these states fail. And then the American people could make a judgment, and then if you had a situation, we'd have some consensus about what we ought to do. I hear people argue that, well, Americans aren't interested in foreign policy, and they're not interested unless you tell them it's important. And I think one of the most heartening things about this horrible situation in Kosovo is the support for ground troops among the American people, because even though, as the President said a couple of weeks ago, they may not have been able to find Kosovo on a map, they figured out what's going on there. And because they said, hey, we want to stop this. Now, what does it mean for the military? Right now, our military is organized and budgeted based upon the Powell Doctrine, which is not surprising since he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that set up the military. And they're organized to fight two major regional contingencies, either in the Gulf or in Korea, where the Powell Doctrine would imply if if Saddam should be so foolish as to try and invade a country, use a weapon of mass destruction, then you go after him. Similarly, if the North Koreans should be so foolish as to invade South Korea, then you have a large war in which you try and get it over quickly and decisively. And that's how they're organized. But they're being asked to implement the Clinton Doctrine, which means, and you may see this in the paper, people will say, well, we go to Kosovo, we're in Bosnia, we don't have enough to carry out our primary mission, which in their view is to fight these two major regional contingencies, because that's their doctrine and that's the way they're organized. And similarly, you see it in terms of, you may have seen, we have a shortage of cruise missiles. Well, how do we end up with a shortage of cruise missiles? You ended up with a shortage of cruise missiles because nobody envisioned us doing all of these sort of low-level operations continuously. And when the military was faced with a choice of buying new weapons to keep technologically ahead of our potential foes, they chose to put their money there rather than to buy a lot of ammunition. You find out you're having recruiting and retention problems because the youngsters who come into the service and go through basic training are trained to do one thing, and then they end up doing something else, and they're not quite sure what they're supposed to be doing, and they hear the Congress saying, well, wait a second, what is our objective in Kosovo? What's going on? Why are we there? People may not realize, we still have military forces in Haiti. We forgot about that. Well, they haven't, because those kids are there. And he said, well, how long? What? And you may remember our objective when we went to Haiti was to restore democracy. They had never had it. And then, of course, what we said, we're only going to stay for 6 months with the main part of the force. Well, that'd be quite an accomplishment to bring democracy to a nation that never had it in 6 months. See? But again, you see those particular doctrines. You have seen the Joint Chiefs of Staff go before the Congress and to the President and say, hey, we don't have enough money. And the irony is we're spending at about the average level, even if you control for inflation, that we spent during the Cold War. Well, they say they don't have enough money because, again, they're organized to deal with the Powell Doctrine, but you're being asked them to implement the Clinton Doctrine. You can be sure of one thing. I don't know how this horrible situation in Kosovo is going to work out, but you can be sure of one thing. When it's over, the military is going to go to Congress and say, we need more money, because that's not in our budget plans. Somebody once quipped, we spend $280 billion a year on defense, but we got to pay extra to use it. Well, the fact of the matter is, you got to pay extra because that's not what they're planning. They're planning to fight these 2 major regional contingencies, and everything is done there. My wife was in the audience a couple of years ago, were asked to go over to NATO headquarters to give this speech on quality of life, and then General Jalwan was then running it, and I said, that's going to be what can I say after 2 words? I'm for quality of life. It's a good thing, take. But anyway, so they had this conference. They asked me to be the keynoter, so I went over there. We were sitting at the table, and the commander of the army forces in Bosnia happened to be at the table with General Jalwan. And he said, boy, I can't wait to get those kids out of Bosnia, and so I can get them retrained for their real mission. General Jalwan looked at him, he said, maybe that is your real mission in Bosnia. What happens is the Army argues when you take the forces out of Bosnia that it's going to take them 9 months to get them ready for their real job. Because again, they see their real job as the Powell Doctrine, not for the Clinton Doctrine. Now, if I had anything to say with it, I would say to the military, look, plan for 1 major regional contingency and then develop these forces to get involved in these other things, what they call operations other than war, or other than major wars, because this seems to be what you're going to be doing a lot of. I mean, after all, you've been to Haiti, you've been to Bosnia, and if you heard the president's speech when he went to Rwanda, when he went to Africa last year, and he said, I didn't know it was happening when this occurred back in '94, but he said, if I knew then what I know now and we find out about it again, we get involved there. I mean, that's the Clinton Doctrine. So you're going to be doing an awful lot of things, and you better organize yourselves for it, and you better spend less money on buying these new futuristic weapons and spend a lot more money on ammunition, because you're going to be using up a lot of it. So with those thoughts, let me stop there and take whatever questions or comments you might have about anything you think my remarks may have triggered in your mind, or anything you'd like to talk about. The question was, could I explain the difference between genocide and ethnic cleansing? Well, what you have to understand, if you can think back to when we had the horrible situation in Rwanda, the official line of the U.S. government was there are acts of genocide being committed. So somebody said, what's the difference between acts of genocide and genocide? Well, legally, if you say there's genocide, then you must do something. The international community must do something, because you have international conventions against genocide. We have signed the treaty. We couldn't say, hey, that's none of our business. And that's why you use the term, because if you declare that it's genocide, then you get the United Nations, involved. It becomes a completely different ballgame. Now, what's the practical difference? None. I mean, there's no real difference, but what you have is a legal situation. One of the things that's happening, for example, in Kosovo now is when NATO, which is a defensive alliance, I mean, basically what NATO says, attack on one is an attack on all. Okay, I mean, that's the way it's organized. And when a defensive alliance now wants to go, if you will, on the offensive, to go outside, in Bosnia, it had UN authorization, because we tried the UN peacekeepers. That didn't work. So the Security Council said, okay, NATO, we're deputizing you to take care of this situation, because we feel it's a matter of concern to the international community. Now, this time we have not gotten UN authorization, because we know the Russians and probably the Chinese would veto it. So the question becomes, what is your legal basis now for getting involved? And what we're arguing is this whole genocide convention or crimes against humanity becomes our legal basis. Others who oppose it say, no, it's a civil war, and because it's a civil war, you have no right to go in. I mean, that's pretty much the Russian position right now, and it's rather ironic how the world turns. Who would have ever thought the Russians would be arguing for legality, you see, in international politics. But anyway, that's when you use those terms, there are legal things that kick in depending upon, you know, what you say. And one of the good things I think that's happening in this period that hasn't received as much attention is the international community slowly but inexorably is saying that certain types of behavior will not be tolerated. And you have the war crimes indictments of people where they operated in Bosnia. You now have an international criminal court, which I wish we had signed up for. We did not. You've had what happened to Mr. Pinochet when they got him in London. And so I think the world is beginning to change. And when we look back, you know, a decade from now, we'll say, you know, we have these things in international relations that says certain type of behavior is not your own business anymore, and we're going to do something about it. But anyway, to answer your question, that's the difference right now because of the legal things. You know, the question was that, you know, haven't we in effect become de facto allies of the KLA, kind of their Air Force? And that was part of the whole problem with Kosovo, because you were intervening in a situation in which you were trying to bring about something that neither side wanted, okay? The Serbs, Mr. Milosevic, basically had said, we want Kosovo to be part of Serbia. It's historically been part, you know, all of the history, you know, of it. And it's very crucial to us. This is an internal matter, and you can't tell us what to do, and you're not going to station foreign troops here. The KLA, particularly the Kosovo Liberation Army, they want to have a situation in which they are independent. We said, no, you're going to have this semi-independent status. You're going to be an autonomous republic within Serbia. So you will have a certain amount of, you know, self-rule, but you can't have your own foreign and defense policy. Now, that's part of the problem, because when you have objectives that neither side wants, when you get in there, you don't make either side happy. And Henry Kissinger, I thought, wrote quite eloquently about that early on. He said, before you get involved, you got to realize this is what's happening. Unless you want to go in there and run things, you got to remember that, you know, this is a situation. So if you send troops in there, you may find the KLA and the Serbs both at you because you're trying to get something neither wants. Now, things have changed. I think given what has happened so far, it's hard for me to see Kosovo becoming a part of Serbia again. Okay? In other words, it's going to be independent. The question becomes, do you give it all to Kosovo, or at some point are you going to allow the Serbs to have some swath of it, which is their most sacred areas? Are you willing to do that to end this? But you're going to have to go in. It's going to be an international protectorate. You're going to have, somebody's going to have to go in. And of course, the wording has changed. You know, they talked about, well, we wanted to have NATO troops in, and then we said, no, as long as NATO's involved, international troops. So you're beginning to see kind of the end game as both sides maneuver to accomplish what they would like. But remember this, and from my days when I was in the Pentagon and when I was in the Navy during the 60s, I remember this very clearly. You can never get at a peace table what you don't win on the ground. I mean, keep that in mind, because if you say, hey, we want to have all those refugees settled, and we want that, or you're going to have to make it happen. You're not going to get that at a peace table. I mean, that was the mistake we made with in Vietnam when we started negotiating with the Vietnamese. You know, we wanted this and we wanted that. Well, we didn't have it, and they knew that we weren't willing by, you know, the late 60s to pay that price, you know, price for it. So you got to keep that in mind. And remember with Bosnia, everybody says, well, air power worked in Bosnia, you know, why didn't it work here? Well, there's a couple of differences. One, you had the Croatian Muslim military about to drive the Serbs out of Bosnia, and by settling at Dayton, Mr. Milosevic actually got more than he would have if the war had gone on. I mean, the real losers of Dayton were the Croatians and the Muslims. So, I mean, I think you need to keep that in mind when you say, oh, well, he gave up a lot of things at Dayton and Bosnia. No, he didn't. He actually did okay from a strictly a realist point of view. The question was, since we have a president who's interested, obviously, in humanitarian issues, shouldn't we have made some arrangements prior to the start of the war for dealing with these refugees? Sure. And that's what I meant by, you usually plan for the worst and hope for the best. It's clear now that the president became convinced, on the advice of most probably Secretary Albright, that Mr. Milosevic was simply a bully, that once you showed you were serious and you were willing to, use military power, and you had all of NATO united, that in effect he would, give in right away. I mean, and that was the operative principle. And it didn't work, and that's why militarily you have problems, and also with the refugees. And now we're basically playing catch-up ball, and that's unfortunate. That you do that. And I think when history writes about President Clinton, they're going to say that in all things he did with foreign policy and domestic policy, everything was good tactically, but not strategically. In other words, you do this and you take advantage of this situation now and you kind of handle it, and you don't think of the long term. Well, what will I do if it doesn't go well? And in foreign policy in Haiti and Bosnia, he was lucky. I mean, in Haiti, General Cedras and his colleagues, decided not to make a fight of it. And in Bosnia, that we did not suffer any casualties, so you never had to answer that particular question. Here, it may have caught up with them both from the humanitarian point of view as well as the military. There was a two-part question, one about North Korea, and you heard somebody speak and talk about the fact that they're developing these weapons of mass destruction, which we call chemical, nuclear, and biological. And then, of course, is there room for both doctrines? Well, let me take the first part about North Korea. There's no doubt about the fact that North Korea is trying to develop these weapons of mass destruction. But you have to keep in mind that we have lived since 1945 with these weapons of mass destruction, and we have dealt with it. Now, how have we dealt with it? Well, we dealt with it in two ways. Number one, through deterrence. Well, you say, okay, you got a few. If you use them, let me tell you what's going to happen to you. And certainly in the nuclear area, we have way far ahead of anybody. I mean, if North Korea should be able to, shoot one nuclear weapon, we would know where it came from. And so the devastation would be swift and overwhelming. And even if they did biological or chemical. The other way we've dealt with it is try and set up an international regime in which the international community makes those nations who do that pariahs. Is it perfect? No, but, again, I think we don't give ourselves enough credit. I wish at the end of the Cold War we had the biggest damn parade you ever saw and said, hey, look, the democracies of the world stood up to the most evil empire in history, and we won without going to war. And we have shown that liberal, democratic, capital, however you want to describe it, is really the way in which man can fulfill his highest potential. But we didn't. We kind of slid in the Gulf War, and then, and we did not do that. And similarly, I mean, the progress we've made, and we have a chemical weapons treaty, okay? We have a non-proliferation treaty. I mean, look how India and Pakistan were treated. Now, India has been a great democracy. When they exploded that bomb, people say, hey, you're doing something wrong. And I think, yeah, is it perfect? Of course not. Will it ever be as good as domestic law? No, but I think we're moving that direction. I mean, North Korea is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that's why we're able to keep economic sanctions on them, because they have violated a treaty they agreed to. Now, you might say, why did they ever sign that thing? I think same reason that the Russians ratified Helsinki. They never thought it would have the impact. I mean, I remember when Jerry Ford and Henry Kissinger went to Helsinki, everybody blasted them, because part of it was we were theoretically legitimizing Soviet control over Eastern Europe. But the other part of it says, we can hold you responsible for the way you treat your people. And it had a tremendous impact on what happened. Second, you can bring the doctrines together if you recognize the fundamental differences and are willing to deal with them. If you say, look, this is a humanitarian situation, it has strategic implications, but they're not that great, or it's not a vital interest of the United States, so therefore I'll do what I do what I can. But what you don't have that, we've got 325 planes over there, we're sending more. People say you're going to use ground troops. When you put those 2,000 infantry people in Albania, those are ground troops. Those are Army ground troops. And those helicopters and long-range rocket systems they're putting in there are there to support ground troops. So, but that's not really what people meant when they said put in ground troops to stop, what was going on. So I think you got to be careful. You can meld them, but you can't use them in such a way that you confuse people at home and abroad. And I think that's the real problem. You have to be very, very clear about it. The question was, if the United States is going to assume the role of policemen in the world, what's the role of Congress? Well, I think what's happened, with the end of the Cold War, the Congress has begun to reassert itself in foreign policy, which really during the Cold War they more or less, just kind of put bounds on what the executive branch could do, but they never directly challenged it. And you see the Congress being willing to challenge it because the stakes are not quite as high. It's hard, what's happened in Kosovo is horrible. But if we don't succeed there, it will not threaten us in the same way that, a Hitler or a Stalin victory would have. So they're willing to insert themselves into the process, and they make it harder. Our China policy is a mess because the Congress is involved. And, the idea of this, the way because they get involved, with this most favored nation status. Now, every year Congress has this vote in which the left and the right, now the religious right is joining in with the humanitarian left and get up there and they say all these horrible things about the Chinese. Most Americans don't pay attention to it. Most people in Washington don't pay attention because they know, as I was testifying one time, and this congressman who went on to become a senator, so I won't tell you his name, was just beating the heck out of me and the Pentagon and the military. And I was about to come out of my chair, and he sort of motioned to me, wrote something. This young aide came down and handed it to me and said, "Larry, don't pay attention to anything I'm saying. I'm talking to my constituents." So they give these speeches, we go through this ritual, but the Chinese take it personally because they're up there, look what they're saying about us, you see. And so, yeah, they should be involved, but you got to be careful. Now, I think in the next administration, people will recognize the new role because this decade, the rules have been changing. Nobody's quite clear what they are. But I think in the next decade, we're pretty clear what Congress is going to do. You're going to have to get them involved, and you're going to have to talk to them. Remember, it was the Congress that told Clinton he needed to give a speech. It was the Senate who met with them, bipartisan. Before you go to Kosovo, you got to give a speech and tell the people why. And I think that was a good thing. He gave that one kind of off-the-wall speech when he spoke to the union people who was kind of making it up on the fly, and then he gave a pretty serious address. But I think that was a positive role. And, the Senate basically said even people who don't like Clinton, politically, like John McCain, said, look, we're at war. We can't, criticize. The House has always been unruly, yeah. The question is, what is the rationale for all of our troops in Germany? I'll give you the rationale, and then I'll tell you what I think of the rationale. The rationale is that if you don't have a stable Europe, this will impact on the interests of the United States. That the only way to have a stable Europe is to have a significant American military presence there, because our presence assures the Europeans we haven't left them alone to their own devices and they won't start, a war again. I happen to think that's hogwash. I think it's time for the United States and the world to let Europe begin to play its rightful role, okay? The Germans are a democracy. The Russians are very weak. They are a democracy, not a perfect one, but they do have elections. In fact, a lot of the statements these fellas in Germany are making, in Russia are making about Serbia is because they're going to run for election the next time, and they want to get on record as, with their constituents, many of whom support their Orthodox Slavic, brothers in Serbia. We say that democracies won't go to war with each other. people with a common currency are going to go to war with each other. I mean, that banker in Frankfurt, that Dutchman sitting there, is going to be, very, very powerful. So I think it's time for us to allow Europe to grow up. Now, it's not just Europe's fault, it's ours. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If you look at NATO, you have the Supreme Commander, that's Wes Clark, and then you've got a Southern Command, which is a Navy Admiral, and he sits in Naples. Well, the French a couple of years ago said, how about make that a European command? And we said, oh, no, you can't. We got to be an American command. Well, we should have said, that's a good idea. You guys buy some ships. Go spend some money, and you can patrol the Mediterranean, and we'll go to the Persian Gulf, and we'll go to Asia where we're needed. Let me tell you, the European Union has a larger GDP than the United States. They've got more people. They collectively, all of them, spend $100 billion less than the United States, and the gap is widening. So I would, rather than expanding NATO, I would put a sunset provision and say, look, we'll give you 10 years to adjust to this, and then we'll be equals. We'll sign a mutual treaty. If we got, if we got interest in the Gulf or China, whatever it is, we can work together. Because really, this situation in Kosovo should be handled by Europeans, because they are there, they understand, they're going to have to deal with the refugees, and it's much easier for their publics to understand what's going on. And certainly, you're dealing a country of 10 million people. The European Union has a population of 320 million people. They certainly should be able to handle it. So. Well, you got to make that a campaign issue and vote for some people who'll do it. But, there's a book on NATO celebrating its 50th anniversary I think it's sometime this month. Yeah, and Susan Eisenhower, the president's granddaughter, got together a group of people to write articles, and they had the usual suspects, Kissinger, Brzezinski, Scowcroft, and all that. And I wrote an article saying this, and you can imagine when that comes out, they'll stop inviting me to my own job at the Council on Foreign Relations, because you can't say anything about NATO. Oh, it's sort of like criticizing, apple pie or something. But I think it's really, you see what bothers me about our foreign policy, and it's Republicans and Democrats, is we're still stuck in kind of the Cold War and World War II. Milosevic is a horrible person, but he's not Hitler. And if you start, then if you see it that way, you're going to take the wrong actions and deal with it, the wrong way. And I think it's time for Europe to grow up and go on its own, because they're going to start resenting us after a while. I mean, they're going to start resenting us as long as we keep that, heavy hand on. But anyway, that's the rationale. Do I think that NATO and the European Union could they can't exist peacefully for very much longer, NATO and the European Union. I'll tell you why. Because the European Union is supposed to have a common foreign and defense policy. And after they get a common economic policy, they're going to say, well, why do we want to do what the United States tells us, militarily? I mean, if you take a look at the situation in Kosovo, the United States has been able to force the Europeans to adopt a strategy they're not, maybe the British are, but the rest of Europe is not comfortable with the strategy. I happen to think our military strategy is correct, but that's not the point. Basically, and the Europeans, you remember in Rambouillet, the first Rambouillet, the British and French were going to do it, okay? And they weren't getting any place. So we swooped in, get out of here, we're going to take charge. And the British and French guys went home. So then it became our problem, you see? And I think we've got to get over that, and we've got to allow them to develop. And, they still have militaries that are waiting for the invasion from the East, okay? They got, they don't have professional militaries except for the British, and now the French are moving that direction. They have conscripts that serve for 12 or 13 months. They can't be used outside their homeland without their mother's permission. I mean, and so they're in the wrong century. I mean, they need to take advantage of this technology and develop, because they're more technologically advanced than we are in some areas, and this is an unnatural thing. And so I think if we don't begin to move, eventually people are going to come to, there's going to be a great deal of resentment about it. The question is, with what China has of our missile secrets, will we have another Cold War? Let me say a couple of things about the missile secrets, which I think are very important. We, the United States, normally we react too strongly in foreign policy. And I can tell you about this missile secrets to China as an example. The Chinese, we call them the Red Chinese and all that for the longest time. And then when Kissinger and Nixon said, look, we need an opening to China to balance the Soviet Union, we went ahead and all of a sudden the Chinese became our big friends. When I was in government in 1984, they sent me to China to help them to develop a logistics system. I took the smartest military people we had here. We spent 3 weeks over there helping them to develop a logistics system. Why did we do that? Well, we forgot. Oh, now they were enemies, now they're our big friends, you see. And the Chinese, I had a lot of fun with the Chinese because we were doing this, and I said, what are you going to do for us? I said, oh, you're a great power, and all that kind of. I said, well, what is this relation? What are we getting out of it, see? And a lot of, we let them into a lot of facilities, and they were able to get some things. Remember this latest crisis that came up, this stuff started in the mid-'80s, that when they went to the labs, because we had sort of embraced them and they became our friends. And I remember you had the Chinese foreign minister over, and he was talking about how during World War II with the Flying Tigers, and they had saved people, and people sort of forgot, 30 years of what had happened after World War II. The other part of it is, given the way in which militaries are organized now, the military relies on civilian technology more than it used to. In other words, it used to be military technology was off over here, and they were ahead of the commercial. I mean, the Boeing 707 was the KC-135, and the computer industry and the internet was all driven by defense. Well, what happens now is defense takes civilian technologies, incorporates them into military to make the weapons better. So that technology's out there, so it's going to be hard to control it. Let me say something good about President Clinton here, because I think his China policy is right on. He got off to a rocky start, but I thought the speech he gave yesterday was the right thing. Look, if you want to make them an enemy, you can. You don't have to. You're going to have to recognize them. They're a large country, they're very dynamic people, and they're going to want to play a role in the world. What you want to ensure is that they accept the standards of international behavior. And, this idea of every year given a most favored nation status. Do you realize most favored nation status means we treat you like everybody else? Do you know Iraq has most favored nation status from the United States? I mean, it's really kind of an anachronism. So we've got to treat them, like everybody else, and you can't ignore them. When they do something you don't like, you tell them, hey, you shouldn't be jailing those dissidents. But what the Chinese will tell you is, hey, look, when you came to us in the late 60s, we were in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, which made this stuff look like a day at the beach. You didn't mind then. If anything, things are better. Which is true. Now, if you're in jail, it's not too good for you. But the fact of the matter is, China is moving. And in international politics, people say, well, should we have the Chinese premier here? We had Khrushchev here. Okay, and all around the country, and this was a guy who was banging his shoe at the UN, saying he was going to bury us. You got to deal with these people. And there are things you could agree on and things you disagree, and you got to manage the relationship. So, is it going to be easy? No. Going back to your question with the Congress, and it's not going to be as easy, as it used to. Again, what goes around comes around. When I was in the Republican administrations, the Democrats in Congress every year were trying to deny China most favored nation status. And they would get enough votes because they controlled the Senate, and the presidents, Reagan and Bush, would have to veto it, and then we would get 34 senators to line up. Now, many of these same senators are voting with Clinton to give it to them, see? They've changed. And then, of course, you got some Republicans on the other side that, so I mean, this is, it becomes a cheap way for them to play, and we have to keep that within bounds, because it's one thing to posture about taxes or something where nobody believes you anyway, but these foreign countries do not understand our independent legislature. They think that the executive, they would tell you, and I had people tell me, you can control the Congress if you want to. We can't even control our own party, you know, but they don't believe that. See? They don't believe that. And because of that, you have a lot of problems in international politics. The question was, given the high moral ground of the United States, would I have submitted the Kosovo situation to the United Nations? It was submitted actually last September. And the United Nations basically said this situation is unacceptable and something should be done about it. So in that sense, you did, you know, do it. Would I have gone now when I saw what, you know, Milosevic had violated the October agreements and was beginning this ethnic cleansing, knowing that I would get the vetoes? No. I think that the UN had already spoken. Would it have been preferable? Sure. There's no doubt about the fact that at some point we're going to wish that we did. You know, people forget that in the Gulf War, before the UN authorized, we didn't do anything. We set up the blockade, and there was an Iraqi ship that was trying to pass. And the commander sort of radioed back, okay, what do I do? And Jim Baker persuaded George Bush, don't do anything till we get the UN on board because we're trying to establish, you know, a new precedent. And at that time you could, because we had much better relations with the Chinese and with the Russians, and they saw this invasion, you know, as a threat to international order. So I think it would have been better, but given what was happening, no, I really don't think you could have allowed yourself to get into some procedural thing where 500,000 people literally, you know, are driven from their homes. And you did go to the UN. I think it's important. You go to back and read what they said last September, and I think a good lawyer probably could make a pretty good case for it. The question was, in view of my statement that, you know, Kosovo will end up as an autonomous area, why should we not be arming the KLA? Because my statement was, I think that's going to happen. I don't think you have, you know, because of the situation on the ground. But remember that a year ago, the U.S. government called the KLA terrorist. You know, this is not, you know, the French underground or anything that you're talking about here in terms of an organization and the way that they do things. I think that would make the situation worse because they will not be happy with maybe the troops in there or giving up part of Kosovo, whatever the situation has. And if you arm them, I think you're going to be asking for trouble. And I think that's why when the troops go in there, it's not going to be an easy situation. So I know some people have argued that, I guess Joe Lieberman and some other folks. I don't support that. I don't think it's like the situation you had in Bosnia at all. I think they're not that a stable a group that you would want to give arms to because it may end up in a situation you would not be comfortable with. The question was, in my comment about we don't need to be able to fight two major wars simultaneously troubles you, and we shouldn't, I guess from what you said, you don't think we should be fighting these other wars. Well,
No, I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying that seems to be what their mission is. I'm saying, why don't they accept that mission?
Oh, why don't they accept it? Well, that's an excellent question. Why does the military accept it? I think because they recognize that in these wars you end up in these situations where it's not very clear what you want them to do. And, you know, Maxwell Taylor had I think a very insightful saying about Vietnam. He said, we sent the army into Vietnam to save South Vietnam. We took it out to save the army. And I think that is their nightmare, you know, that you put the military in there, they're in this no-win position, and you're expecting them to solve a problem which doesn't have a military solution. So that's why they don't like to get involved. But I think to their credit, they go. I mean, you know, they're told to go, they go, and they do it. And you know, this leaking that we've had in the past week shouldn't be surprising. You know, John Kennedy said, you know, victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat but one. And remember this, that General Powell did not want to go to war in the Gulf. He wanted to keep the sanctions in for much longer, and he was telling it to Bob Woodward. Now, if that war had not gone well, you would have seen many of the same things. And the military, and I spent time on active duty. I spent another 20 years in the reserves. You got to remember that they will always give you worst case, which is their which is their job. And you have to say, okay, I understand, but I think, it can be done this way or that way. And that's the way it should be. And that's why we have civilian control. So it just goes against the way they would like to do things and organize themselves. I mean, after all, you've never seen a recruiting poster that says join the thing and go to Bosnia, or or fight a civil war in so-and-so. I mean, you see high-tech airplanes and Navy carriers and people jumping out of planes. I mean, because that's their ethic. But I think they've done a remarkable job in Bosnia. And I think given the situation in Kosovo, militarily, they've done as much as you could expect. And so it's not their fault, but they just don't want to be blamed. And they don't want people to think that they told Clinton that this air power could work, because it looks like they told him it wouldn't work.
Please join me in thanking our speaker, and we hope to see you next time.